A little girl on a quiet street, all alone as night falls. But what happens next will leave you speechless. This story is unlike anything you've seen before. Stay until the end. You won't believe how it all turns out. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means everything. Amina's small feet tapped softly against the pavement as she walked through the busy streets of the city. Her heart felt light as she clutched her little pink backpack to her chest. It had been a fun day at the community center where she and her friends had played games and shared stories. The sky above was painted with hues of orange and purple as the sun began to set. She knew it was getting late, but she wasn't worried. Her father had always told her to be brave, and she believed she could find her way home. She had done it before. The streets were still busy, but as she walked further, the familiar landmarks began to disappear. The colorful murals she always used as a guide were nowhere to be seen. Her confidence wavered. She glanced around, her heart pounding a little faster. Her small fingers tightened around the straps of her backpack. Her mind raced as she realized she had missed a turn somewhere. Panic crept into her chest and she stopped walking, turning in every direction, trying to find something, anything that looked familiar. But nothing did. Okay, it's fine, she whispered to herself, her breath shaky. Just retrace your steps, like Daddy said. She spun on her heel, retracing her path. Her eyes darted from building to building, searching for something she recognized. But the street lights were flickering on now, and shadows began to stretch longer, swallowing the sidewalk. The once busy street was now quieter. People hurried past her, too focused on their own lives to notice a little girl standing still, looking around in confusion. She spotted an older woman walking toward her. Amina's heart lifted with hope. "Excuse me, ma'am," she called, her voice soft but clear. "Can you help me? I think I'm lost." The woman glanced at her but kept walking, her gaze cold and dismissive. Amina's heart sank as she watched the woman walk away without a word. She felt the sting of tears building in her eyes, but she blinked hard to keep them from falling. Her father always said, "Tears won't help you solve a problem, baby. Stay calm and think." She tried to remember his words. Her phone. Her father had given her a phone for emergencies. Her small hands fumbled to unzip her backpack, digging inside for the phone. Her fingers wrapped around the familiar device, and she pulled it out with a sigh of relief. She pressed the power button, but nothing happened. Her eyes widened. No, she muttered, tapping the screen repeatedly. But it was dead. The battery had run out. Tears finally spilled from her eyes, blurring her vision. She wiped them away with her sleeve, sniffling loudly. She was all alone now, and it was getting darker. The street lights flickered overhead, casting dim, orange light over the cracked pavement. Amina looked around again, her small heart beating so hard it felt like it might burst from her chest. The crowd of people she had seen earlier was gone. The street was nearly empty now. Her breathing grew faster, shallow gasps as her mind filled with the scariest thoughts. What if I never find my way home? What if I have to sleep here? What if bad people come? She shook her head, trying to stay strong. She had to be brave. She started walking again, her pace quickening with each step. Her legs were short, and the blocks felt longer than usual. The once warm air now felt cold against her skin. She glanced up at the sky and saw that it had turned completely dark. Stars were barely visible through the glow of the city lights. Her pace slowed, exhaustion setting in. Her legs ached, and she could hear the distant sound of car horns echoing down the street. She looked left, then right. Nothing looked familiar. Her throat felt tight. Her heart told her to keep walking, but her legs told her to stop. She sat down on a small concrete bench near the edge of the sidewalk, curling her arms around her knees. Her little frame shook as she tried to stay warm. She rocked herself slowly, her eyes scanning every movement in the distance. Then, she heard it. A low rumble of an engine. Her head snapped up, and her eyes widened with hope. A police car rolled slowly down the street, its flashing red and blue lights reflecting off nearby buildings. Relief washed over her. Police! They can help me. She jumped to her feet, waving her arms wildly in the air. Help! Please help me! She called out, running toward the edge of the street. The police car slowed, its engine humming steadily. It came to a stop a few feet away from her. The driver's side door swung open with a heavy creak, and a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out. His uniform was crisp, his badge shining under the glow of the streetlight. His sharp eyes scanned her from head to toe, his lips curling into a slight smirk. Amina's heart lifted with relief. "I'm lost," she said, stepping closer. "Can you help me, please? I'm trying to get home." Her voice was small, filled with hope. The officer tilted his head, his smirk growing into something more sinister. He shoved his hands into his pockets and slowly walking toward her. Each of his steps echoed in the quiet street. Amina's eyes flickered with uncertainty. Something about his gaze made her heart beat faster, but not in a good way. "Where are you supposed to be, huh?" he asked, his voice laced with mockery. His eyes squinted as he leaned in close, too close. "Out here all alone, huh? Looking for trouble?" Her brows furrowed in confusion. "No, sir," she said softly, her voice shaken. "I'm just trying to get home." She glanced at his badge. The name on it read Blake. He huffed a short, cruel laugh. "Home, huh?" He looked up and down the street, his smirk never leaving his face. "Little girl like you ain't got no business being out here. Y'all think you can do whatever you want." His eyes hardened as he stared at her. "Ain't nobody coming for you." Her heart froze in her chest. She took a step back, but he reached out, his hand clamping down on her arm like a vice. She gasped, yanking her arm back, but his grip was too strong. "Let me go!" she cried, fear filling her voice. She tried to pull away, her small hands hitting his arm, but it didn't matter. He didn't let go. Her breath came in short, rapid gasps. "Quiet!" he hissed, his eyes narrowing. "You think you can scream, and someone's gonna come running? Not tonight." His grip tightened and pain shot up her arm. "I'm gonna teach you a lesson." Her eyes filled with terror. "Please, I just want to go home." She sobbed, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her voice cracked as her strength faded. But he didn't listen. He dragged her toward a nearby street lamp. Her sneakers scraped against the pavement as she kicked and fought, but he didn't stop. Her screams echoed off the buildings, but no one came. No one came to help. Her voice grew hoarse as she begged, "Please, please don't hurt me." But he didn't stop. He reached into his utility belt, pulling out a thick roll of silver duct tape. Her eyes widened with horror as he ripped off a long strip. She screamed louder than ever, thrashing as hard as she could. But he was too strong. Her small arms were pinned to her sides as he wrapped the tape around her arms, her waist, and her legs. Her chest heaved with shallow, gasping breaths. Her eyes darted around, searching for someone, anyone. But the street was empty. Her heart sank into despair. Her face was wet with tears and her sobs echoed in the cold night air. "There," Blake muttered, stepping back to admire his work. "That ought to keep you quiet." He stared at her for a moment, then tilted his head, his eyes sharp with cruel amusement. Bet you think someone's coming for you, huh? Well, guess what? Nobody's coming. He turned his back to her, walking away as if she were nothing more than an object. The police car's engine roared to life. Amina watched in horror as his taillights faded into the distance. Her chest rose and fell as she gasped for air. Her mind was numb with terror. Cold air wrapped around her like an icy blanket. Her heart thudded in her chest, her breaths coming in short, uneven gasps. She was alone. Alone in the dark. The street was silent except for the distant hum of cars and the faint rustle of wind brushing against the buildings. Amina's chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths as she twisted and pulled against the layers of duct tape binding her to the cold metal pole. Her small wrists burned from the rough edges of the tape, and her arms ached from the tight pressure. Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the sweat on her skin. Her lips trembled as she tried to call for help, but her voice was hoarse from screaming. Her body was exhausted, and every breath felt like a battle. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear her vision, but the darkness around her was suffocating. Shadows stretched long and wide across the empty street. The only source of light came from the flickering street lamp overhead, which buzzed softly with an uneven hum. It bathed the area in a dim orange glow, casting her shadow onto the pavement like a small, lonely ghost. Her heart pounded in her chest, each thud louder than the last, filling her ears like a drumbeat of terror. Her eyes darted in every direction, searching for someone, anyone. The cars in the distance never slowed. Occasionally, a pedestrian would walk along the far side of the street, but none of them noticed her. Some glanced her way, their gazes lingering just a second too long before they hurried along, pretending not to see. A group of teenagers passed by, their laughter loud and careless. One of them glanced at her, nudging his friend. They both looked at her, pointing and laughing like she was part of some cruel joke. Amina's face burned with humiliation. She tried to call out to them, but her voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "Help! Please!" she croaked, her throat dry and sore from earlier screams. But the boys just laughed harder. One of them pulled out his phone and snapped a picture. Flash lit up her tear-stained face for a brief moment before they walked away, still laughing. Her head slumped forward, and her tears soaked the front of her shirt. Her heart hurt more than her wrists or arms. The shame was worse than the cold air biting at her skin. Her mind was a storm of thoughts. She replayed every moment leading up to this point. The feeling of relief when she first saw the police car. The hope she felt when she saw the officer step out. The confusion when he didn't help her. And finally, the overwhelming terror when he dragged her to the pole. Her eyes squeezed shut as she tried to push the memories away, but they came back sharper, clearer. His voice echoed in her head. "Ain't nobody coming for you." The words felt like shards of glass in her mind, cutting deeper each time she thought about them. Her body trembled, not just from the cold, but from the realization that he might have been right. Nobody was coming for her. Nobody cared. Her breath grew shallow as panic set in. Her mind raced with the worst possibilities. What if I stay here all night? What if he comes back? What if he does something worse? What if I never get home? She squeezed her eyes shut, her lips moving in silent prayers to herself. "Please, God, let someone find me. Please. I don't want to be here. I want my daddy. I want my mommy. Please." Her prayers were interrupted by the sound of footsteps echoing down the street. Her eyes shot open, heart leaping with hope. Her breath caught in her throat. The footsteps grew louder, closer. She craned her neck, her eyes darting toward the sound. It wasn't Blake. The man was older, his clothes ragged, and he moved with a slow, uneven shuffle. Her eyes filled with hope. Finally, someone to help me. She opened her mouth to call out, but her voice failed her. Her heart pounded in her chest as she gathered her strength. "Help! Please, help me!" she croaked as loud as she could. Her voice cracked, but it was enough to catch the man's attention. He stopped, his eyes narrowing as he stared at her. He scratched his scruffy beard and tilted his head as if he was trying to figure out if she was real. His eyes swept over her, a little girl taped to a pole in the middle of the night. His face twisted into a mix of confusion and suspicion. He squinted, glancing around as if looking for cameras or someone watching. "What's this? Some kind of prank?" he muttered to himself, his voice low and raspy. He shook his head and waved his hand dismissively. "Nah, I ain't getting involved in that." He stuffed his hands in his coat pockets and kept walking. "No, wait. Please don't go, please." Amina's voice cracked as she pulled against the tape, her small arms straining with all her might. The man didn't even look back. His footsteps echoed until they faded away. Her heart crumpled into pieces, the weight of helplessness crashing down on her like a heavy stone. The tears she had fought so hard to hold back came pouring out, uncontrollable and endless. Her body felt numb. Her hands throbbed with pain from how tightly she had tried to pull herself free. Her shoulders ached. Her knees buckled, but the tape held her upright. Her chest shuddered with quiet sobs, her face buried in her arms. Her breathing came in short, rapid gasps. Her eyes stayed closed as she whispered to herself, "It's not real. It's not real. It's not real." But it was. Every second was real. Minutes turned into hours. She had no sense of time. Her legs were cramped and her fingers tingled with numbness. Her body was tired. Her head bobbed forward and her eyes grew heavy. She tried to stay awake, but exhaustion was stronger. Her mind drifted, her breath slowed, and her body slumped against the pole. The cold air gnawed at her skin, but she no longer felt it. Her sleep was shallow, filled with flashes of fear. She dreamed of Blake's face, his cold, hard eyes staring at her with that crooked grin. She flinched in her sleep, jerking awake with a sharp gasp. Her eyes darted around. The darkness was still there. A flickering streetlight buzzed softly above her. Her heart sank. It wasn't a dream. She pressed her forehead against the cold pole, closing her eyes. Her body ached from head to toe. She was so tired. The world was quiet now, completely still. Not a single sound. Not even cars. The silence was thick and heavy, pressing down on her. Her eyes were half closed, her breaths shallow. Then she heard it. A voice. "Amina!" It echoed from down the street. Her eyes shot open, her breath catching in her throat. Her heart started racing, pounding in her chest. Her head snapped up, eyes scanned the street in every direction. "Amina! Baby, where are you?" The voice was loud, deep, and full of urgency. She knew that voice. She knew it like she knew her own heartbeat. Her father. Her head jerked from side to side, her voice croaking through the cold air. "Daddy, I'm here, I'm here." Her voice was weak, but it was enough. Her father's silhouette appeared at the end of the street. He was running, his large frame moving faster than she'd ever seen. "Amina, stay there, baby. I'm coming," he shouted, his voice trembling with urgency and desperation. Her body shook with sobs, relief washing over her like a flood. He reached her in seconds, dropping to his knees. His strong hands worked quickly to tear the tape away, his face twisted with rage and heartbreak. His hands trembled as he ripped away the layers, muttering, I'm here, baby. I'm here. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Her tiny arms wrapped around his neck as soon as they were free. She buried her face into his shoulder, her sobs loud and broken. His large hand cradled the back of her head, his other arm holding her tight against him. She felt his chest heaving as he held her, his breath heavy with exhaustion and rage. Who did this to you? His voice was sharp now, filled with raw, dangerous anger. His eyes scanned her face, wiping the tears from her cheeks. Tell me, Amina, who did this to you? Her lips trembled as she whispered the only word she could manage. Police. His eyes went cold, hard. His jaw clenched and his nostrils flared as he stared at the streetlight like it was the cause of his rage. All right, he said, his voice low and deadly. All right, baby. Daddy's got you, and I promise you he's gonna pay for this. The cold night air bit at Amina's skin as she clung tightly to her father's chest. Her small body trembled, not just from the chill, but from the shock that still held her in its grip. Her tiny fingers clutched at the collar of his jacket, holding on like her life depended on it. Her heart was still racing, and her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. Her father, General Darius Harris, crouched low, one arm wrapped securely around her, the other hand gently brushing her back in slow, comforting strokes. It's okay, baby, he whispered, his voice low but firm. You're safe now. Daddy's here. His heart ached with every tremble of her little body. His eyes were locked on the street around them, scanning every shadow, every movement. The street light above flickered, casting flashes of dim orange light over his face, highlighting the hard set of his jaw and the cold intensity in his eyes. His face was stone, unreadable, but the fire behind his eyes burned brighter than ever. He stood slowly, holding Amina against his chest. She buried her face in his shoulder, her small fingers curling tightly into his jacket. She didn't want to look at the street, didn't want to see the pole where she'd been tied. Her breaths were shallow, quick little gasps that broke his heart. His gaze shifted toward the pole. The duct tape still hung in loose strands, fluttering slightly in the breeze. His eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening until his teeth ground together. The image of his little girl, tied up and crying, played in his mind on a loop. Every time he blinked, it was there again. His grip on Amina tightened, his eyes dark and unblinking. His mind was no longer calm. It was a storm of rage. He turned, walking back toward his car with steady, deliberate steps. His boots crunched against the pavement, each step louder than the last. Amina's breathing had slowed, her small body still clinging to him like a lifeline. Once he reached his car, he gently opened the back door and carefully placed Amina in the back seat. Her eyes were half closed, her exhaustion finally catching up to her. He knelt in front of her, his large hands resting on her shoulders. He looked her directly in the eyes, his face serious but kind. Listen to me, baby girl, he said softly, his voice steady but firm. I'm gonna handle this. You hear me? Nobody, and I mean nobody, puts their hands on my daughter. His eyes searched hers for understanding, and she nodded slowly, her lips pressed together tightly to keep herself from crying again. Her eyes glistened with fresh tears. Can you stay here for me? He asked, his voice gentler now. I'm not going far. I just need to make a call, okay? She nodded again, rubbing at her eyes with her small fists. Darius rose to his full height, pulling out his phone with one smooth motion. His fingers moved swiftly across the screen as he typed out a message. His face was hard as stone. His jaw set in an expression that his soldiers would recognize instantly. The face of a man about to go to war. He tapped the call button, lifted the phone to his ear, and waited. "Major Lewis," he said as soon as a line connected. His voice was sharp, commanding. "Get me a list of every officer on patrol in Zone 5 tonight. I want badge numbers, names, and locations. Send it to me within 15 minutes. I'm not asking. I'm telling you." A voice on the other end responded with a hurried, "Yes, sir. Right away, sir." Darius hung up, his eyes fixed straight ahead. His fingers flexed at his sides, his hands itching for action. He glanced back at Amina, who had curled up on the seat, her small body folded into itself like she was trying to disappear. He felt a new surge of rage. They did this to her. They made her feel this way. His phone buzzed in his hand. A text popped up with a list of names. His eyes scanned the list quickly, his gaze hardening when he saw it. Officer Jacob Blake, Zone 5. Patrol duty from 7 p.m. to 3 a.m. Blake. He repeated the name in his head, tasting the bitterness it left behind. He knew what had to be done. His movements were sharp and purposeful as he climbed into the driver's seat. He glanced back at Amina through the rearview mirror. She was staring blankly at the window, her eyes distant, lost in her own world. Her fingers picked at a loose thread on her pants, pulling it slowly. The sight of her, so quiet, so small, sent a sharp pain through his chest. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. He inhaled deeply, closing his eyes for a second to calm the rage boiling inside him. Not here. Not in front of her. He needed to be calm for her. But every second that passed with the image of her tied up on that pole, every tear she shed, every frightened breath she took, pushed him closer to the edge. He drove in silence, his face set in grim determination. The city lights passed by in a blur, neon signs flashing against the glass. The streets were quieter now, fewer cars, fewer people. His eyes remained on the road, his mind locked on one name. Blake. He repeated it like a mantra, each repetition stoking the fire in his chest. Minutes later, his car pulled up to the front of the police precinct. The large concrete building stood like a fortress, bright white lights illuminating the entrance. Darius parked the car and sat for a moment, his eyes fixed on the doors. He glanced at Amina in the back seat. She was asleep, her head resting on her arm. Her small face looked peaceful for the first time tonight. He stepped out of the car, closed the door quietly, and adjusted his coat. He moved toward the entrance with the slow, deliberate steps of a soldier entering enemy territory. His eyes never wavered, his shoulders back, his posture straight and commanding. He wasn't a father right now. He was a general. And this was his mission. The officers at the front desk noticed him immediately. They knew him. They knew his rank. Their eyes widened and they straightened their posture, standing at attention. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone demanded respect. "Where's Officer Jacob Blake?" Darius asked, his voice low and dangerous. The officers exchanged glances. One of them, a younger man with nervous eyes, cleared his throat. I think he's still in the locker room, sir," the young officer replied, his voice shaken. "Should I?" "No." Darius cut him off, his eyes like cold steel. "I'll handle it myself." He didn't wait for permission. His boots echoed through the halls as he walked down the corridor, each step slow and deliberate. Every officer he passed moved aside without a word. His eyes were fixed straight ahead. He wasn't here to ask questions. He was here for justice. He reached the locker room door and pushed it open. Inside, the smell of sweat, metal, and cleaning chemicals filled the air. His eyes scanned the room and found him. Officer Blake, sitting on a bench, unlacing his boots. He didn't notice Darius at first, but when he looked up, his smirk froze. "General Harris," Blake said slowly, his voice carrying a hint of mockery. "Didn't expect to see you here, sir." Darius stepped forward, his eyes locked on Blake like a predator sizing up prey. The air in the room grew heavy. Blake's grin faded, replaced by unease. "You're Officer Jacob Blake, correct?" Darius said, his voice like ice. "Yeah," Blake replied, leaning back against the locker, arms crossed. "What's it to you?" Darius's eyes narrowed. His next words were spoken with chilling precision. "You put your hands on my daughter." Silence filled the room. Blake's smirk vanished. His eyes darted to the door, then back to Darius. "Look, I think you've got the wrong guy, General," Blake said, raising his hands. "I don't know what you're talking about." Darius didn't blink. He stepped closer, towering over Blake. "You tied her to a pole." Darius continued, his voice a low growl. "You left her there, alone, in the cold." His words cut like a blade with every pause. Blake shifted uncomfortably, his eyes looking everywhere but at Darius. "Look, man, I didn't mean nothing by it," Blake stammered, his voice cracking. "It was just a joke." Joke?" Darius said, leaning down until his face was inches from Blake's. "Does she look like she's laughing?" Blake had no answer. His lips quivered, his eyes filled with fear. He knew there was no escape. "Stand up," Darius ordered, his voice sharp as a whip. Blake hesitated for a second too long. I said, "Stand up." The stillness inside the police precinct was suffocating. Every step Darius Harris took echoed like a war drum against the cold, sterile floors. His gaze was sharp, unwavering, and locked onto one target. Officer Jacob Blake. Blake's eyes darted to the side, scanning the room as if searching for an exit, but there was none. Not this time. Darius's footsteps slowed as he stopped just a foot away from Blake, his tall frame looming over the officer like a storm cloud about to break. The air between them felt electric with tension, charged with something far more dangerous than words. "Stand up," Darius said again, his voice low but sharp enough to cut steel. Blake hesitated, eyes narrowing as he glanced toward the other officers still lingering near the door. He licked his lips, trying to mask his growing anxiety. "I don't answer to you, General," he said, his voice carrying a hint of false bravado. He tilted his head, folding his arms as if to regain control of the situation. "Last I checked, this is my station, not your battlefield." Darius didn't move, didn't flinch. His eyes locked onto Blake's, unblinking, unwavering. It was the kind of stare that could silence a room full of soldiers. No words were spoken, but every officer in the room felt it. The weight of authority, power, and rage wrapped in perfect control. "Stand up," Darius repeated, slower this time, each word deliberate, each syllable a warning. Blake's lips parted, his eyes darting to the door, looking for a way out. But his instincts told him that moving would only make things worse. Slowly, reluctantly, he pushed himself off the bench, his arms still crossed, his stance shifting to something meant to look confident. But there was no confidence in his eyes. Not anymore. He stood, hands resting on his hips, chin raised just a little too high in defiance. "You think you scare me, General?" Blake sneered, forcing a grin to return to his face. "You might scare these rookies, but not me. I've dealt with worse than you." Darius tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing with deadly precision. His hands stayed at his sides, but his body language changed. Subtle, but powerful. Shoulders square, feet planted firmly, muscles tense, but controlled. It was the stance of a man who had seen war and was ready to fight it again. His next words came slowly, each one dripping with ice-cold venom. "Did they beg you too?" Darius asked softly, his eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. "Did they cry while you tied them up? Did they scream for their father?" Blake's smirk faltered. His jaw tightened. His fingers twitched at his side, but he didn't move. He didn't blink. Silence hung between them like a noose. "Yeah, that's what I thought," Darius said, stepping forward. His eyes locked on Blake like a lion locking on to prey. "You see, I'm not like them, officer. I'm not the one you can intimidate. I'm not afraid of that badge on your chest, and I'm sure as hell not afraid of the system you hide behind." Blake took a step back, his back bumping into the lockers behind him. His eyes darted to the officers in the room, but none of them moved. None of them were coming to help him. The shift in the power dynamic was undeniable. Darius wasn't just a father seeking justice. He was something much, much worse. A soldier on a mission, and Blake had become his target. "You messed up, Blake." Darius continued, his voice as steady as thunder before a storm. "You touched my daughter, my blood, my baby girl. You didn't just cross a line, you set the whole damn field on fire." His voice grew colder, his words slower. "And now I'm going to put it out." Blake's breathing quickened, his chest rising and falling in sharp, shallow bursts. His eyes locked onto Darius's face, and for the first time, real fear seeped into his expression. He raised his hands, his voice shaky but loud. Hold up. I didn't know she was your kid, man. It was just a misunderstanding. Just a dumb prank, that's all." He pointed toward the hallway like it would somehow prove his innocence. "She was yelling at me, screaming about going home, and I just... Look, man, I didn't mean nothing by it. I was just messing with her." Darius took another step forward. Blake pressed himself harder against the lockers. His breath came faster, his eyes wide with panic. "You're a coward," Darius said quietly, his eyes never leaving Blake's face. "A coward with a badge, hiding behind it like it means something. But that badge doesn't protect you from me." Blake shook his head, holding his hands up in surrender. "I'm sorry, all right? I messed up. I know I did, but I'm just a man, General. I ain't perfect. You think I'm the only one who's done something like this, huh? You think I'm the only one?" He pointed toward the other officers near the door. "They've done worse. All of them." His words didn't have the effect he'd hoped for. The officers near the door stiffened, glancing at each other but staying quiet. None of them dared to speak. No one came to Blake's defense. Darius's eyes didn't waver. His silence was worse than any response. It was a predator's patience. "I'm sorry, man," Blake repeated, his eyes wide, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry, okay? I got kids too, all right? I didn't mean it. It was just a bad call, a mistake, but I didn't mean it." He was pleading now, his voice desperate. His eyes filled with something far too late. Regret. "Please, man, I got a family too. I got kids." Darius's face remained stone cold. He glanced down at Blake's hands, still raised in surrender. Slowly, he leaned in close, his face inches from Blake's. His voice dropped to a whisper, soft but more deadly than any shout. "Did you think about my daughter's family when you left her on that pole?" Darius asked, his voice low and sharp as a blade. "Did you think about her tears, her fear, or how she'd cry for her daddy? Did you think about her family then?" Blake didn't answer. He couldn't. His lips quivered, his body shaking from head to toe. "That's what I thought," Darius said, stepping back. His eyes flicked toward the officers at the door. "Arrest him." For a second, no one moved. Blake's eyes darted wildly, his head shaken in disbelief. No, 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 y'all can't do that. You can't do that. His voice rose to a shout. You're making a mistake. You hear me? This is all wrong. Two officers stepped forward. One pulled out his handcuffs. Blake thrashed, his voice rising in panic. I can't go to jail, man. I can't go to jail. I got kids. His voice cracked as he struggled against them. His eyes darted to Darius, wild with desperation. Please, General, please, I'm begging you. But Darius didn't move. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He watched with the cold, steady gaze of a man who had seen far worse and survived it all. The handcuffs clicked into place. Blake's shouts echoed down the hallway. His face twisted in panic, his eyes red and wet with tears. He dropped to his knees, looking up at Darius, his breath heaving with sobs. Please, General, please, I'm sorry, don't do this. Please, my family, my kids, they need me. Blake's voice cracked with raw desperation. I'm sorry, I'm begging you, please, don't do this. But there was no mercy in Darius's eyes. He crouched low, his face inches from Blake's, his eyes as cold as ice. You're gonna rot, Blake, Darius said quietly, his voice low but clear. And every night you close your eyes, you're gonna see her face. You're gonna hear her scream. That's your new reality. Get used to it. Blake sobbed like a broken man, his head bowed low. The officers pulled him to his feet, dragging him down the hallway as his cries echoed behind him. Darius stood there for a moment longer, his eyes watching until Blake was gone from sight. Slowly, he exhaled through his nose, his chest rising and falling with steady, controlled breaths. He turned and walked toward the exit, his eyes calm, his mind clear. His daughter was safe. But the war wasn't over. Not yet. The sun had just begun to rise, casting soft, pale light across the quiet neighborhood streets. The world was slowly waking up, but for Amina, the morning brought little comfort. She sat curled up on the living room couch, wrapped in a thick blanket, her eyes distant as she stared at nothing in particular. Her legs were pulled up to her chest, and her small fingers fidgeted with the loose threads of her pajamas. Her face was blank, but her eyes told a different story. A story of fear, exhaustion, and confusion. Her mother, Lisa, sat next to her, gently running her fingers through Amina's hair. Her own face was tight with worry. Her lips were pressed into a thin line as she fought to stay strong for her daughter. Every few minutes, Lisa would glance toward the front door, her eyes filled with anticipation and concern. Her hands never stopped moving, stroking Amina's hair, rubbing her back as if the constant contact would somehow chase away the nightmare they'd just lived through. The door opened with a soft click, and both mother and daughter turned their heads. Darius Harris stepped inside, his presence filling the room instantly. He closed the door slowly, his movements precise, controlled, and deliberate. His eyes scanned the room, landing on Amina first. His gaze softened when he saw her small figure huddled under the blanket. But there was something else in his eyes, too. Something colder. Something darker. "Daddy?" Amina called out, her voice small but relieved. She threw off the blanket and ran to him, her bare feet patting quickly against the hardwood floor. She wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face into his stomach. Her little frame shook as she held on tight. Darius crouched down, wrapping his arms around her, pulling her close. His large hands cradled her head, fingers gently brushing through her hair. He kissed the top of her head, closing his eyes as he took a slow, steady breath. "I'm here, baby," he whispered. "Daddy's here." Lisa walked over, her arms folded tightly over her chest. Her eyes locked onto Darius's face, scanning him for answers. She knew that look on his face, the quiet, deadly calm he always had after a mission. She didn't need to ask what had happened, but she asked anyway. "Did you get him?" Her voice was quiet, sharp, and full of restrained anger. Her eyes darted between him and Amina, who was still clinging to him like a lifeline. Darius's eyes met hers, cold and steady. He nodded once. "He's done," he said plainly. No further explanation was needed. The weight of those words settled in the air between them. Lisa stared at him for a moment longer, her eyes narrowing. She didn't press him. She knew what that meant. Blake was finished, and there would be no coming back from it. "Good," she said quietly. Her arms dropped to her sides and she let out a long, shaky breath. Her shoulders sagged, as if all the weight she had been carrying had finally been lifted. She knelt down beside Darius and Amina, wrapping her arms around both of them. They stayed like that for a moment. A family bound together not just by love, but by survival. Amina didn't say much after that. She stayed close to them, moving between her parents as if afraid that one of them might suddenly disappear. Lisa carried her back to the couch, tucking the blanket around her. The little girl leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, her eyes heavy with sleep. Darius sat in the chair across from them, his eyes still distant, his mind far away. He watched them in silence, his hands resting on his knees. Hours passed. The sun rose higher, filling the living room with bright golden light. The TV was on, but the sound was low. Headlines scrolled across the bottom of the screen. Police officer arrested for assault on child. Public outrage grows. Darius watched the screen, his face expressionless, his eyes sharp and calculating. They had replayed the footage from the police station multiple times. The moment Officer Jacob Blake had been placed in handcuffs had gone viral. People were talking. News stations were calling it a turning point in the police accountability. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers pressed together as he watched the broadcast. Blake's face was plastered across the screen. Mugshot, blank stare, eyes red from crying. His name was on every news channel, every social media platform. People were calling for justice, demanding change. The hashtag #JusticeForAmina was already trending. The phone on the table buzzed. Darius glanced at it, his eyes narrowing. He picked it up and saw the name on the screen. Major Lewis. He sighed through his nose before swiping to answer. "Go ahead," Darius said, his voice steady but tired. "Sir, I thought you'd want to know," Major Lewis said on the other end. "The footage from the precinct got leaked. Whole world's seen it now." "I know," Darius replied, glancing at the TV. Blake's face was still on the screen, his name bold in the headline. "Doesn't matter. He's where he needs to be." "Yes, sir," Lewis said, his voice quieter now. Words spreading fast. People are calling for protests. City Hall's already talking about issuing a statement. There was a pause on the line. "Sir, they're calling you a hero." Darius's eyes shifted toward Amina, still curled up on the couch. Her little fingers played with the edge of the blanket as she watched cartoons in silence. Her eyes were tired but focused, as if her mind was somewhere far away. "I'm no hero," Darius said flatly. His gaze didn't leave his daughter. "I'm just a father." The line went quiet for a moment. "Understood, sir," Lewis said finally. Darius ended the call, placing the phone back on the table. His eyes never left Amina. She was still so small, too small for everything she'd been through. She sat still, her hands twisting the fabric in slow, repetitive motions. Her little fingers pulled at the same loose thread, over and over. Her breathing was steady, but her eyes were too focused, too sharp for a child her age. Lisa noticed it too. She reached over, gently taking Amina's hand and pulling it away from the thread. Amina blinked and glanced up as if pulled from a trance. Her eyes met her mother's, and for a moment, she looked like she might cry. Lisa cupped Amina's cheek, her thumb gently brushing away the tears before they could fall. "It's over, baby," Lisa said softly. "He can't hurt you anymore." Amina's bottom lip trembled. Her eyes darted to Darius, her father, the man she'd always seen as unshakable, unbreakable. She stared at him for a long moment. "Did you stop him, Daddy?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. Darius leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. He nodded once, his voice was calm but firm. "Yes, baby. He'll never touch you again." She stared at him a moment longer, searching his face for any sign of doubt. She found none. Slowly, she nodded, her eyes lower into her lap. She reached for Lisa's hand and held it tightly. Her small fingers squeezed hard. Lisa squeezed back, pulling her close. "I'm tired, Mommy," Amina whispered, leaning her head on her mother's shoulder. Lisa kissed the top of her head. "I know, baby. I know." They sat there like that for a long time. The light from the window slowly shifting as the sun climbed higher into the sky. The world outside continued to spin, filled with noise, protests, and headlines. But inside that living room, everything was still. Safe. Later that day, Daria sat with Amina in her room. She had finally fallen asleep, her little chest rising and falling with steady, peaceful breaths. He watched her for a long time, his eyes filled with quiet sorrow. He reached out and brushing a curl away from her face, his fingers light as a feather. "I promise," he whispered softly, his voice cracking for the first time. "I promise, baby girl. Nobody's ever gonna hurt you again." He stayed there until she was deep in sleep. His phone buzzed again. Another call, another message, more news stations. But for now, he ignored it all. He leaned back in the chair beside her bed, eyes still on his daughter. His heart was heavy, his mind was tired, but his resolve was unshaken. No amount of headlines, protests, or calls for justice could give him back the peace that had been stolen from his family. But one thing was certain. The world would never forget Amina's name. The warm sun poured down on the white sand beaches of the Maldives, casting a soft glow on the crystal-clear waves that rolled gently onto the shore. The air smelled of salt water and fresh tropical breezes, and the rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the beach created a peaceful melody. Amina sat by the edge of the water, her toes buried in the cool, damp sand. Her fingers played with the grains, letting them fall through her hands like tiny golden waterfalls. Her face was calm, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the sky met the ocean in an endless stretch of blue. Her father, Darius Harris, stood not too far behind her. His arms crossed over his chest as he watched her carefully. His eyes, usually sharp and unyielding, now held a softness rarely seen by anyone outside his family. His gaze followed Amina's every movement. It had been weeks since that horrible night, but the image of her tied to that pole, scared and crying, was a vision that refused to leave his mind. No matter how many nights passed, no matter how far away they were from that street, the memory clung to him like a shadow. Lisa approached from behind, carrying 2 bottles of water. She handed one to Darius without saying a word. He took it with a nod, his eyes never leaving Amina. Lisa sighed quietly, standing next to him. Her eyes followed his, watching their daughter as she played alone in the sand. A gentle breeze lifted Lisa's braids, and she brushed them behind her ear. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes filled with a mother's worry. "She's quiet today," Lisa said softly, glancing at Darius. "Yeah," he muttered, taking a slow sip of water. "She's been like that a lot lately." Lisa frowned, tilting her head. Her eyes stayed on Amina, who was now drawing shapes in the sand with her finger. Circles, stars, and tiny hearts. Her little brow furrowed in deep concentration. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't crying either. It was that in-between state that worried Lisa the most. Not sad, not happy, just still. "She's healing," Lisa said, though her voice carried a hint of doubt. She glanced at Darius, her eyes narrowing slightly. "And so are you." Darius huffed a short, humorless laugh, his eyes locked on Amina. "She's stronger than me," he said quietly. "She shouldn't have to be." His jaw tightened as he swallowed hard, his eyes narrowing at the memory. "She's just a kid." Lisa reached out, placing a gentle hand on his arm. He didn't flinch, but he glanced at her, his gaze softer now. She squeezed his arm, offering silent reassurance. "She's strong because she has us," Lisa said firmly. "She'll be okay. You'll see." They stood there in silence for a while, the waves rolling in and out like a steady heartbeat. The soft, constant rhythm of the ocean surrounded them, its calmness seeping into their bones. It was a world away from the chaos of the city, the flashing sirens and the screaming headlines. Here, there were no cameras, no police reports, no courtrooms, and no battles to fight. Just the sound of the waves and the soft chatter of birds in the distance. Amina suddenly looked up, her big brown eyes searching for them. When she spotted her parents, her face softened. She lifted her hand, waving at them with a small smile that made Lisa's heart swell with warmth. Lisa smiled back, lifting her hand to wave. "See," she said, nudging Darius gently. "She's getting better." Darius nodded, his eyes never leaving Amina. "Yeah," he muttered. "She is." Later that afternoon, the family sat together under a large straw umbrella. Amina sat between Lisa and Darius, nibbling on slices of fresh mango from a small plate on the table. Her legs swung back and forth from the edge of her chair, and she leaned her head on Lisa's arm, her eyes half closed with drowsiness. "You ready to take a nap, baby girl?" Lisa asked, glancing down at her with a soft smile. "No," Amina mumbled, her voice thick with sleep. "I'm not tired." Lisa said with a playful grin. "Not tired, huh? That's why you're leaning on me like a baby koala?" Amina pouted, frowning as she sat up straighter. "I'm not a baby," she muttered, rubbing her eyes with one small fist. "All right, big girl," Lisa teased, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "But if you fall asleep on me, I'm calling you my baby koala for the rest of the trip." Amina let out a small giggle, a real one. Not forced, not polite, real. Lisa's heart swelled at the sound. It was the first real laugh she'd heard from Amina since that terrible night. She glanced at Darius, who had been quiet for most of the afternoon. He was watching them, his face calm, but his eyes were different now, softer. Amina reached for another piece of mango, munching quietly. Her gaze shifted to the water, watching the small waves lapping at the shore. She tilted her head, her little brow furrowed like she was thinking deeply about something. Lisa noticed the change in her expression. She reached over, brushing her fingers gently through Amina's curls. "Penny for your thoughts, baby girl," Lisa said softly. Amina stayed quiet for a moment, her fingers still playing with the edges of the mango slice. Her little shoulders rose and fell with a deep breath. "Do you think he's still crying?" she asked quietly, her eyes never leaving the waves. Lisa and Darius both glanced at each other, their eyes locking in shared understanding. Lisa shifted in her seat, her arm wrapping around Amina's shoulders, pulling her close. "Maybe," Lisa said gently, "but that's not our worry anymore." Amina glanced up at her father, searching his face for reassurance. "Daddy?" she asked, her voice small but steady. "He can't hurt me, right?" Darius leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He stared at her for a long moment, letting her words hang in the air. Slowly, he reached out, cupping her small face in his large hands. His thumbs brushed softly over her cheeks as he looked her straight in the eyes. "No, baby," he said firmly, his voice steady like the ocean's waves. "He'll never hurt you again. Nobody will." Her eyes searched his, looking for cracks, looking for doubt. She found none. Her small shoulders relaxed, and she nodded slowly. "Okay," she whispered. She leaned forward, pressing her head against his chest. Darius wrapped his arms around her, his chin resting on top of her head. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of her little body sink into him. Lisa watched them quietly, her heart full but aching at the same time. They had been through so much, but somehow, here they were, still together, still whole. The sun was beginning to set, the sky painted in soft pinks, oranges, and purples. The waves continued their steady rhythm, rising and falling with no end in sight. Amina watched the colors shift across the sky, her face calm, her eyes no longer distant. She leaned into her father's embrace, feeling safe, warm, and loved. "Daddy?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, baby," Darius replied, his chin still resting on her head. "Can we stay here forever?" she asked, tilting her head up to look at him. Her eyes were full of quiet hope. Darius glanced out at the ocean, his eyes following the endless line of the horizon. The world beyond it was loud, messy, and dangerous, but here on this beach, everything felt still, quiet, peaceful. He sighed deeply, pressing another kiss to the top of Amina's head. "Maybe not forever," he said softly, glancing down at her with a small smile. "But for as long as you want, baby girl." Her eyes lit up and she grinned, her first real smile in a long time. She leaned back into his arms, her eyes growing heavy with sleep once more. The sky continued to change colors, the waves continued to roll, and in that moment, for the first time in weeks, everything felt right. Darius closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the sun sink into his skin. His arms held his daughter close, his heart finally at peace. For once, there were no battles to fight, no enemies to face, just his family. And for now, that was enough. If you made it this far, you've seen the full story of courage, justice, and the unbreakable bond of family. Amina's journey from fear to peace is a reminder that no one deserves to be left in the dark. Justice was served, but the fight for change never stops. If this story moved you, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps bring more powerful stories like this to life. Stay safe, stay strong, and remember, justice always finds a way.